So this is a conversation with Molly Crabapple. She's an artist and writer living in New York. It's a conversation that I've been meaning to have for a long time because it's on a topic that was actually the subject of my master's thesis in 2016. And it's one of those topics that those who know about it know a lot about, and those who don't know about it don't know anything about. And that is the legacy or the story of the Jewish Labor Bund or Bundists and the ideology that is Bundism. I wanted to speak to Molly about this because of her personal connection. So her great-grandfather was himself a Bundist, and she wrote about this story in an essay that I will link in the show notes, in the blog post. I tried to, in this conversation, and hopefully successfully, to convey why myself, as someone of Lebanese and Palestinian origins, with no direct ties to Judaism or the Yiddish language, was so interested in this movement. So in this episode, we'll be talking about Molly's view on the legacy of Bundism. What can we learn from this concept of Doikayt, or here-ness, as opposed to the there-ness of Zionism? And what are some of the more broader reflections on homeland, language, diasporism, and nationalism that we can get out of this experience that the Bundists have had? So in essence, the idea of Doikayt is that wherever one lives, that is one person's homeland. And obviously the contrast here that I just mentioned is that for Zionism, the homeland is somewhere else in what ended up becoming the State of Israel in historical Palestine. I hope that by the end of this episode, Molly and I would have succeeded in making you more curious about the Bund. And if you are interested in reading and learning more about the Bund, you would be able to do so on the website. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes and on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes. If you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com. You can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. Thank you for your time.
Hey, I'm Molly Crabapple. I'm an artist and writer in New York City. I'm the author of 2 books, and I'm working on a 3rd one about the Jewish Labor Bund.
So thanks, Molly, for having this conversation with me. This is a topic that you and I have been talking about for a long time, and we'll get a bit into this later on. So we're talking about the Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund, also known as the Bundists, which is a topic that I know is close to your heart. So let's start, if it's okay with you, just telling us about who were the Bundists, and after that, just maybe also explain a bit like why do they matter to you personally.
The Jewish Labor Bund was a Jewish revolutionary party that existed between 1897 and, well, there are still some descendants hanging around now, but basically it ended in 1945. It was a political party that was secular, socialist, proudly and defiantly Jewish in an Eastern Europe that was incredibly racist against Jews, and also was anti-Zionist and was armed. It started as an underground movement against the Tsar in Russia. It took part in the 1905 revolution, then the 1917 revolution, fell out horribly with the Bolsheviks, reformed themselves in interwar Poland, became the most popular Jewish political movement in the country, and finally were wiped out in a defiant last stand in the Warsaw Ghetto, a revolt that they helped lead.
And what's your personal connection to them?
My great-grandfather was a member of the Bund back in Belarus. Now, it might sound strange to be so into one's great-grandfather, but I know, right? Like it's kind of a long way off. But my mom's whole family are artists, and my great-grandfather was almost like a father to her. And so I grew up entirely surrounded by his paintings and by his like self-published philosophy books, by stories about him. I felt really, really, really close to Sam when I was growing up. And one of my favorite bodies of work that Sam painted was during World War II. He painted a series of hundreds and hundreds of these watercolors that were like documentary drawings from memory of Volkovisk, which was his hometown back in Belarus. And they were of all sorts of things, right? Like they were of naughty little boys at religious school who were drawing mean pictures of the rabbi and then were getting their asses kicked. They were of like him climbing a tree to spy on girls taking baths in the river. There were, all sorts of things, of holidays, of fights, of a fire that wrecked the town, pogroms. But there was one that I was obsessed with, and it was this picture of this girl, and she had like a little corset and, pretty long skirt, and her hair was all done up like a Gibson girl. And it was at night, and she was on the street, and she was throwing a rock through a window. And next to her was her boyfriend, who was holding a sack with more rocks. Because, a lady should not have to carry her own rocks when she wants to go smashing windows. And the title was Itke the Bundist. And I remember maybe I was like 19 or something, and I was like, Bundist? What the hell is that? Because this was so different than anything that I thought I knew about what life was like in these small Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, or especially what life was like for women, right? Mm-hmm. And so that sent me on this quest to learn about the Bunds, to figure out what it was. And as I realized more about its prominence and indeed its eminence in this part of the world, to wonder why it had been so erased from history.
Yeah, it has indeed been erased from history. I'll talk a bit about my relationship to this topic. It's not personal in the sense, so I don't have a great grandfather with this cool story, unfortunately for me. But I discovered the Bund while doing my master's at SOAS, and I had found this book which I later bought several months later. But at the time, I didn't know what to do with it. Basically, it was just this random book that was written by a Yiddish poet, and his pen name is Yehoash, from what I remember.
Oh wow! So you were reading Yehoash then? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
By the way, he translated Khalil Gibran into Yiddish.
He did indeed. That's why he was such a random find for me. It was in the Jewish studies section at the library, from what I remember. And so he went to Palestine in 1914, and he wrote this book like a decade later, a big book, and then in English it was translated as The Feet of the Messenger, which I still have on me. And in this book, he talks about some things that are just very interesting stuff, like in the again, in Palestine in 1914, he would be seeing people conversing in like half Yiddish, half Arabic, because some of the early Jewish migrants from either the previous generation or even two generations, some of them would have known Arabic by then and so on. And then he mentions all of this, and then at some point he basically says that, I forgot what's the exact sentence, but something along the lines of, actually I have it in front of me. Yiddish in Tel Aviv is taboo. To speak Yiddish in public requires the utmost courage. And this was in 1923. So long story short, I ended up dedicating half a year to just studying this whole phenomenon, this whole period and everything, and writing my master's thesis about it. And so in addition to this oddity, what really attracted me to the Bundists at the time is their focus on language. So the fact that, and you mentioned it yourself in a talk recently, which I will link all of this in the descriptions anyway. But that they found their homeland in Yiddish, in the language. And I'll talk a bit about my own thing with languages, but you yourself are also learning languages. From what I know, there's at least 5 to different extents.
Though none as good as you speak any of your bajillion. I feel very, very dilettantish. I think I'm good for an American, which is a pretty low bar. I studied Arabic, and I continue to study Arabic very seriously just because I love it. I love contemporary Arabic literature. I love reading Ibtisam Azim or Sinan Antun or Kanafani, Darwish, Rashid Hussein. I love it. And I study Spanish because, it's my father's language. Mm-hmm. And right now I'm studying Yiddish so that I can read basically all of the original source materials for the Bund. And, the Bund, they had a really interesting relationship with Yiddish. When they started, the people who founded the Bund, not only did they not really give a shit about Yiddish, most of them didn't speak it. Because there was this real... for some backstory... In Tsarist Russia, there was a place called the Pale of Settlement, which were the westernmost provinces of the empire. And those were the only places that Jews were allowed to live, unless they were like rich or a student or got special permission. But in general, like you were kind of stuck living there. And there were all of these restrictions around you, whether you could go to university, owning land where you could live, basically like a whole sort of racist legal structure that was meant to quarantine and confine Jews. And if you were someone like my great-grandfather who was poor and who was an apprentice leather worker, you probably kind of lived in an all-Jewish world where, you worked at like a crappy little leather tannery and your boss was Jewish and you're Jewish and you live on the Jewish side of town. And so you spoke Yiddish. That was just, your language. But if you were someone who was a bit more upper class, someone, or not even upper class, let's say you were middle class, but let's say you had aspirations, you would be wanting to learn Russian. And not only that, you would idolize Russian. It'd be the language of Tolstoy and Pushkin and Dostoevsky. It would be a great imperial language, capital G. And it would also be the language of social mobility because it would let you, go to university in St. Petersburg. So as is common in many, many social movements, the people who founded the Bund were largely rebellious students who spoke Russian as their main language and maybe knew like a little bit of Yiddish, but not really. And they embraced and learned Yiddish because they had been exiled back to the Pale of Settlement for their political activities. They had been instructed by Marx to organize the workers because the proletariat is the agent of history. And the Jewish proletariat in Vilna did not fucking speak Russian. They spoke Yiddish. And so these students that founded the Bund needed to speak the language that the people spoke. Now, what was interesting is that this purely utilitarian decision started to slowly morph into something else, where Bundists, both like the more intellectual folks, but also the Jewish workers, started being like, wait a second, why do we have to fucking learn Russian? Why do we have to speak the language of empire? Why isn't our language, our minority language, good enough? And they started nourishing and glorifying Yiddish literature, Sholem Aleichem, Peretz, people like that, and trying to focus on their own culture. And this was something that they did to lesser or greater extent in Russia, but it was something that went into overdrive as soon as they were kicked over the border into Poland. And I mean, the Bund was responsible for an entire network of secular Yiddish schools, of poetry readings, of choruses. They had some of like the best fucking music, man. Like just like gorgeous, angry, romantic, like stamp your feet style, protest anthems. They excelled in that in Yiddish. And a lot of it was this reaction, this sort of like, no, our culture is good enough. We're good enough. And it was happening at a time when all over Europe, different groups like Polish people, Greeks, Serbians, they were trying to define this like ethnically based nationalism, which went in horrifically fucked up directions, as we all know. But the Bund was trying to do that, but without the borders and without the blood and without the ethnic cleansing that so many other groups seem to pursue it to. They were just trying to do it as a matter of pride.
As fate would have it, the Bund was officially founded on the same year as the World Zionist Congress was founded.
Yes.
And so this is kind of like a tale of two worlds in a sense, obviously interlinked, and there were some people who were sort of in between and whatnot, but it is absolutely fascinating that people don't know, for example, something else, another story that when I was reading it like caught my mind so much that it ended up being the introduction to the thesis that I wrote. And so I'll just tell the story because I think honestly people should know this. So I have it in front of me. So in January of 1945, a well-known heroine, basically, of the anti-Nazi resistance in the Vilna ghetto, I'm going to butcher her name, Rushka Korczak, was invited to a conference in then Palestine, in what would become Israel, to speak about her experience fighting the Nazis. That was the topic of her talk. And so obviously, being a Jew from Lithuania, she spoke the language of, as you mentioned, of the Eastern European Jews, so Yiddish. So most of the audience also spoke Yiddish, so everything was in Yiddish, and her speech was well received, and everyone applauded and everything. And then this guy, I'm dramatizing the story here, but this guy at some point stands up and says he thanked her for his speech, even though, and here I'm quoting, it was done in a foreign, grating language. And he said this in Hebrew. So the audience was so shocked that they actually prevented him from finishing everything that I'm saying here. I have everything double sourced and everything, because I didn't believe it myself at first. So they were so shocked by what he said that they actually booed him down, basically. But what's very weird about this story is that the guy who actually was basically obsessed with the fact that this Yiddish speaker was speaking in Yiddish was none other than David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, obviously, pretty much the founder of the State of Israel. And what's even weirder, obviously, is that David Ben-Gurion himself was a native Yiddish speaker. He was born David Green in Poland. So this whole phenomenon ended up being called a Kulturkampf, so like a non-violent civil war, I guess, a cultural war, essentially. One historian, I forgot what was his name, Halkin something, he called it one of the great Kulturkampf, the non-violent civil wars of Jewish history. And it's not just about language. Obviously, a lot of it is about now what we'll be talking a bit about, the whole concept of Doikayt, so here-ness instead of this there-ness in a sense, which ended up being Zionism. So I'll just ask you to talk a bit about Doikayt. Actually, I'll just end on this note. And what's really fascinating to me is that a whole movement, a whole ideology that ended up being symbolized essentially by two supposedly opposing languages. So Yiddish for the Bundists, and obviously Hebrew for the Zionists. There were Bundists who spoke Hebrew, there were Zionists who spoke Yiddish. It's always more complicated than just one or two, but essentially that became the story. And because of that, people like David Ben-Gurion in the 40s and the 50s and up until the 60s essentially were aggressively clamping down on Yiddish. Like, people were being spat on. There were like flyers all over Palestine and then Israel, like in Tel Aviv and so on. Posters, including posters in Yiddish, which is very ironic, telling people you should only speak in Hebrew and that kind of thing. I mean, they had to do it in Yiddish because most people obviously spoke Yiddish. So yeah, there is that. And for me, it's just one of those stories that ended up just like, I felt like I've been carrying it for years now. This is actually the first time that I talk about it. So I'll have this awkward segue into this concept of Doikayt. So Doikayt, it's the poster that is going to be the featured image of this podcast, this episode, which is, essentially, what's that sentence? Wherever you are, that's home, essentially.
Here where I stand is my country.
There it is. So can you talk a bit about Doikayt?
To talk about Doikayt, I need to give a little context into why it was so important that Bundists said, here where I stand is my homeland. Since the late 1880s, there had been the early 1880s, there had been a mass migration out of the Russian Empire. Some of it spurred by pogroms, some of it spurred by changes in laws that made it really, really hard for you to live in the capital. Some of it spurred by just like the crap economic conditions there and just real poverty. The vast majority of this mass migration was to America and to countries in South America like Argentina. Some of it also was to Western Europe, and a trickle of it was to Palestine. But it was hard to stay in the Russian Empire if you were a Jew because of the poverty, because of the racism, and just because in general it was an extremely oppressive autocracy. And furthermore, Jews were not viewed as Russians. They were viewed as aliens and foreigners, and they were viewed as racially different. This is something really important. People can argue like whether or not Ashkenazi Jews are European or not, but they weren't viewed as European, and they weren't treated as that. They were treated as a treacherous alien other. And one of the things that Bundists saw really early about Zionism was that Zionism and European anti-Semitism share a lot of things in common. one of which is the belief that Jews don't belong in Europe and should get the hell out. And when the Bundists were saying, "Here where I stand is my country," they were saying, "No, I'm not going to go to Palestine." But it was something more than that. It was saying, "Here where I stand is my country. And if you have a problem with that, then I have a gun and I will fight you." And so much of the popularity of the Bund in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe was because they were a proud armed group that defended the entire community against pogroms. They did it in 1905. They did it in 1917. They did it in interwar Poland. And some of the earliest fights against the Nazis, fights that happened even before the Warsaw Ghetto was built, were launched by Bundists. And they did it also as resistance fighters. And so to say, like, this is my home, it wasn't just this sort of like squishy, hug refugees, tolerance, like I love Thai food shit. It was actually a very defiant act.
And so I didn't even mention this because I'm an idiot, but you actually wrote an essay on my great grandfather, the Bundists, which again I will link in the description. And you mentioned that it's been translated into Arabic and shared by like some Palestinian networks and so on. This brings me a bit to the reason why I got into again studying and researching the Bund is that this relationship with the language is something that obviously Palestinians, a lot of whom, well, most of whom are in exile, know quite well, and something that the literature, Arabic obviously in this case, became this big focus of identity, with obviously names like Mahmoud Darwish becoming this essentially a symbol of either the nation or the people or whatever, depending on people's interpretations. But for me, the fact that there were kind of these parallel stories, simplifying a bit here, but like the story of Bundism, the story of Zionism, and Zionism in the end won, quote unquote, the Kulturkampf. So again, this culture war. But it's important, obviously, to note here that, as you mentioned, with Russia, the Holocaust obviously is the big culprit here. The vast majority of Yiddish speakers who were killed during that period were killed in the Holocaust. And then the policies under Stalin obviously were pretty much anti-Yiddish. And on the cultural level, obviously, you have the assimilation of many Yiddish speakers into American culture, kind of losing that Yiddish, and ended up Yiddish becoming sort of synonymous today with a style of comedy and, an accent and that kind of thing in parts of America, especially in New York. And then the fourth component, in a sense, of why Yiddish ended up being weakened is, as we mentioned before, the policies of the Israeli government. So I wanna talk a bit about that, not necessarily about the policies themselves, people can just look them up and everything, but more about like in the past years, there's no real way of dating when this has been happening. Just before we started talking, I found this article from 87 saying that there's a revival of Yiddish in Israel, for example, and there are, like, if you look at these headlines, you'll find like one every 2-3 years.
Yes.
And so, which obviously says that the revival isn't really there. You have some pockets here and there, but it's not something, obviously it's not supported by the state, for example, for the reasons that we mentioned before. But what for me is something that, and as usual, I'm going to have one of these awkward segues, but what really fascinated me about the Jewish Bund is this aggressive, as you mentioned, like this aggressive in a good way here, aggressive, how do I say this, affirmation or reaffirmation of their Jewishness. So it's not like this was a movement of people who kind of were encouraging only assimilation, for example, which Zionists, actually many early Zionists accused Bundists of wanting to do, for that matter. I have some records from like 1905, 1906, and there were debates sometimes, letters being sent from one Bundist to one Zionist. Some of them are pretty funny. But there was this notion of, we know who we are and we want to strengthen and we will defend it. And the concept of Doikayt for me is something that's very personal because, and this is what I meant by the very awkward segue, it's very personal because I have a grandfather who's Palestinian. For me, when I think of the homeland, it's something that's very vague. It's very ill-defined. It's something that changes a lot depending on when I'm thinking about it, for that matter. And the reason why I ended up kind of finding shelter in a sense in languages is because once you're in a language, you're like in the same reason why you're learning Yiddish. It opens you up to this to a world, essentially, especially through literature. What I'm thinking of today, part of the one of the arguments that I was making in the thesis is that we're seeing this comeback, finally seeing this comeback, not in Israel but in America. And not that it's not, there are small pockets in Israel. I interviewed someone who was by then in London. I forgot the name of the group now, something Babel, something. And he was he was a native Hebrew speaker, and he was teaching Hebrew to people in London. That's how I learned a bit of Hebrew, and from a specific perspective that is explicitly anti-Zionist and explicitly diasporist, as they called it, which meant that for him, in the same way as you have those birthright trips, to go to Israel, and then many of them would learn Hebrew there, or, they get intensive classes or whatever. He wanted to teach people Hebrew for people who did want to learn Hebrew, but decoupling it from this, ideological baggage that came with it, that usually comes with it. And this is something that I find interesting. I don't necessarily believe that everyone should have to learn Yiddish, or else, there's no way of being Jewish or anything like that. And plus, that's none of my business. I'm not Jewish myself. But from the distance I have, in a sense, the privilege that I have, and kind of having this distance between me and this Kulturkampf, the cultural wars of the past, which is sort of happening now in this re-emergence of a very, very vocal Jewish left in America, which obviously you're a part of. And we saw, the phenomenon in Bernie Sanders to a certain extent. Obviously, we saw the I forgot their names now, the If Not Now groups, Jewish Voice for Peace to a certain extent as well, and a bunch of others whose, again, names I'm very bad at remembering. But those are legacies, in a sense, that had this erasure, spatial and temporal erasure, that, as we mentioned, is the Holocaust and Stalin and everything else. Had this not happened, then it would have been even more obvious to say, well, these people are just they've inherited the legacy of the Bund. Did that make sense? Well, I don't know if I just rambled for no reason.
Did. So I have two notes that I always want to give on Yiddish. I mean, the first thing is that while the vast majority of Jews in America are Ashkenazi, the majority of Jews in Israel are not. And Israel, it didn't just wage a war on Yiddish, it waged a war on all diaspora Jewish languages, like, the Ladino of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabic that Jews spoke, the many languages that Jews spoke, because they lived all over the world. I think that sometimes the war against Yiddish was a little bit more bitter because the political founders of Zionism spoke Yiddish, and you can never kind of hate, except if you're hating people who are like you. The other thing, though, that I always want to say with Yiddish, and it's kind of one of the ironies, is that Yiddish isn't a dead language. There are millions of Yiddish speakers, native Yiddish speakers. They're just Hasidic. And one of the things about the Bund that was interesting was they were militantly anti-religious. They were proud Jews in the ethnic sense, but they loathed religion. They served pork at their meetings. They hung up posters on synagogue walls on Friday night because they knew that no one could, take them down until Saturday night. They smoked on Yom Kippur. They did everything they possibly could, almost in the manner of many generations of naughty Catholic schoolboys. The Bund definitely came from that perspective. And so the irony is that while their children in America forgot Yiddish and assimilated sort of into the American left in the 60s and rock and roll, the children of a group that they very much disliked are actually the inheritors of Yiddish as a living language. And it's something I didn't think about until a formerly Hasidic guy started making fun of me and my Yivo pronunciation of Yiddish. But I think, what was I going to say about I had so many thoughts that were spurred by when you were talking, and now I find myself kind of tripping over them. I mean, I think that the Bund's embrace of Yiddish in especially interwar Poland, it reminds me of another group that I was always familiar with, and that my dad knew a bunch of members of, which is the Young Lords, which was a militant Puerto Rican group that came out of Chicago, and has many similarities to the Bund, everything from the sort of working class ethnic pride to the being revolutionary socialists to the making sort of ersatz paramilitary uniforms to the civil disobedience and law breaking stuff. And I mean, I think it's something very natural when you're a minority that's always been told that you're shit. You've always been told your culture is shit. You've always been told you don't have a literature, that you that you don't have a history worth celebrating. You don't have a tradition. And for you to say no, we do have a literature. We do have a history. We do have a language. I mean, I see this sort of self-assertion and pride with many of my Kurdish friends also, who might not even speak Kurdish but are trying to learn it. It's something I'm sure that many people who struggle to preserve indigenous languages feel, and it's certainly something that the Bund felt in their struggle to elevate Yiddish. As for Yiddish coming back, as far as I know, the only dead language that ever came back was Hebrew.
Yeah.
And only with a genocide and the most state brutality possible. I think that dying and dead languages don't come back because languages take a really, really long time to learn, and people have other things that they want to do, go on dates and watch Netflix and stuff. However, there is certainly a small and really dedicated group of people that I know, and I suppose that I'm part of, that are studying Yiddish. And interestingly, not all of them are Jewish. When I was taking the crazy YIVO summer intensive program, I had a guy in my class who was Egyptian, who was learning Yiddish because he was trying to do a thesis on nationalist cinema in Egypt and Israel, and then realized how influenced
I know who you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Or I met a Lithuanian cartoonist, a Christian background Lithuanian cartoonist who was learning Yiddish because she was trying to do this project about these Yiddish teenage autobiographies that were done in Lithuania to understand her country's history. I think it's really, really cool that people that aren't Jewish are studying it, because it means it's actually a legit language with a legit history, as opposed to something that people only study to read their grandmother's cookbook, even though it's totally cool and valuable to read your grandmother's cookbook.
Totally. I took just a couple of hours of Yiddish while at SOAS because, again, forgetting the names here, Jesus. There was an institute next to SOAS that was giving these summer courses. I'm sure people can just Google. If they Google Yiddish London, they'll probably find it in the first page. I mean, for me, it was obviously, it sounds, I also learned a bit of German, so it sounds like German in my mind. And indeed, obviously, lots of common words and so on. But what's different about it is that the alphabet is obviously not Latin. And I have the poster, which again is going to be the preview image of this episode, is a poster that I've had behind me for a long time. It confuses a lot of my Arab friends when they enter the room and they think that I just have this random poster in Hebrew behind me. It's in Yiddish, but people wouldn't know the difference. And so what the reason why I would put it is to kind of be a bit provocative, which I tend to like to do sometimes. And because the message on it is amazing. The message is just something that I can relate to. It's something that anyone who's interested in anything from democratic socialism, some liberals might be interested in it, mutual aids, anything that has this need to create something better than what is currently the case, basically creating a new world. Because one thing that I found fascinating for very different reasons about Zionism and the revival of the Hebrew language is the fact that it succeeded at the end of the day. Obviously, it succeeded with violence, that goes without saying. But the reason why it succeeded is because also there was this dedication, and this dedication was top down, again, going back to the violence, but it's something that people should know. Honestly, I'm not even kidding when I say that many people that I speak to, including folks from like the region, from Lebanon, especially from Palestine, I would assume more people do know this, but from Lebanon, in my experience, many people don't even know that that Hebrew went through an actual revival, like active revival of people forcing themselves to speak it because they themselves didn't speak it. And there are so many stories of there's an Israeli scholar, again with the names, Jesus, Avi Lang, I think, if I remember correctly. I'll find it and find her essay and put it online. And she mentions how her father or grandfather or someone in her family spoke Yiddish as a native language, but growing up in, I'm gonna say Tel Aviv because I can't remember, he was spat on, like attacked, and everything, to the point where he would only speak it within the confines of his home, and then as soon as he leaves the house, he would obviously speak in Hebrew. And this is something that many immigrants can relate to. Stories of Arab immigrants to America who only speak English or who don't teach Arabic to their kids. It's such a common story at this point, that this is why for me it just feels like a missed opportunity. And it's why I wanted to have this episode with you, to actually encourage people, and hopefully after having this episode they will go on that blog post of mine on the website, which will have hopefully a lot of links. I'll try and remember everything that I just mentioned and more, about a movement that actually tried to do it. And the fact that they quote unquote failed doesn't actually say anything about the movement itself. It doesn't actually say much about the value of the movement, the value of the ideals of the movement anyway. But people need to understand that for especially the early Zionists like David Ben-Gurion himself, and here I'm quoting Avi Lang again, for early Israel, Yiddish stank of the ghetto. It was the demotic of the persecuted, the victim, the murdered. And the contrast to this, obviously, the myth of the weak Jew, is a strong Jew. The Hebrew-speaking Sabra being the name of the Jews who were born in what ended up becoming the state of Israel, the new ones, essentially. Sabra is the name of a cactus, I think, in the desert or something.
Yeah, a spiny cactus.
Yeah, so like resilience, essentially. That's the idea. And so this contrast between something that is supposedly weak and something that's supposedly strong, we need to think about this. Like, we need to think of what does it mean for an entire state to be formed and created on this idea of something that is strong, because this is obviously gendered. Indeed, many early Zionists would actually describe Yiddish as kind of this effeminate language. They would explicitly use these terms, and they felt the need to erase it. I'll just end on this note. If there is a need to erase something, especially something that is their own mother language for a lot of these cases, like David Ben-Gurion himself, it's definitely worth asking the question why. What is it about? It's not about the language itself, but what did it represent, essentially, for it to be such a threat? And that's why that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And I'm urging people to just literally Google Doikayt. I'll write it down somewhere in the description, and you will be hopefully positively surprised at how many things you will find under this concept and this topic, and this includes people in recent years kind of rethinking it. So another of my now famous awkward segues, Doikayt, here-ness, again, the idea of wherever we are, that is our homeland. The recent weeks have been particularly tough in New York, where you are, as pretty much most people would probably know by now. Can you reflect a bit on how a concept like this for you can be translated into the concept of Doikayt, can be translated into some of the mutual aid networks that we've been seeing, that for me has been like probably the best, one of the few lights in this horror show that we're seeing right now in the US. Have you really revisited basically in the past few weeks some of these writings you own, the book that you're writing, the story of your great-grandfather, maybe poems or whatever? Has this kind of come back in a sense?
I actually wanted to segue on something else that you were talking about, which is strength.
Yes.
and the myth of the weak ghetto Jew versus the strong Israeli Sabra. One of the reasons that the Bunds legacy is so problematic, or not that it's so problematic, but one of the reasons that the Bunds legacy has been so deliberately erased in Israel is because the Bund represents that dichotomy was always bullshit. This founding literary document of the weak Jew, strong Jew thing is a poem that was written after the Kishinev pogrom by the Hebrew poet Chaim Bialik. That's called City of Slaughter. The Kishinev pogrom was, so I forget the exact number, but over 100 Jews were killed, and also there was a lot of rape of Jewish women. And it was a hideous pogrom. It was something that echoed all around the world. It was something, images of the dead were distributed on mass media. And Chaim Bialik had been sent by the Jewish Yiddishist historian Shimon Dubnov to collect survivor testimonies in the aftermath of the pogrom. And he collected these testimonies, and then he sort of chucked them. And he wrote this poem about the disgusting, bowing, scraping, weak ghetto Jew that allows his wife to be raped in front of him because he's hiding in a toilet. It says things like they died like dogs, and like dogs they were dead. It is a howl of self-hatred. And a massively influential poem for Zionism, and something that established his name as a Hebrew poet, a major document. But it was all fucking bullshit, and he knew it was bullshit. In the Kishinev pogrom, it was not that men passively allowed their wives to be raped while they hid. Men fought back, and so did women. They were just overwhelmed with superior numbers. But they were tough working class people who fought, and not just fought one-on-one, but organized armed militias, and were put down by sort of force of superior numbers plus the police. So even the sort of like founding literary document, which was written in 1903, was built on bullshit. And the truth was that Jews always fought back. Whatever one thinks of the Bolsheviks and Leon Trotsky, and I am not a fan, Leon Trotsky ran the Red Army. The idea that Jews didn't fight back until David Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky and the Haganah and the Ergan and the Palmach came is such fucking ahistorical bullshit that I don't even understand how it passes in sort of common parlance. And I think the thing about the Bund was, first, yes, they were an armed group that ran some of the most heroic and sort of legendary self-defense militias in Russia and later in Poland, and then helped lead the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Like, they did it as Jews. They didn't just do it as as Bolsheviks, as communists, the way that Trotsky did. And I think that that's very upsetting to a narrative that always posits Jews back in the old country as weak and simpering and cowardly. And I think that specifically is why Israel has had such a problem with their story.
One of the not sure if I actually have a point to this, but I just remembered when you were talking. One of the things that we ended up just quick context. I took Hebrew at while I was doing my master's, so I was part of. It ended up feeding into this thesis, obviously, but it was just a coincidence because it was being offered, and I like learning stuff. But they showed us in class some of those awkward ads by the Israeli government, and I'm saying awkward because they're horrible, and awkward because they really make no sense. But essentially, one of those ads, for example, is about the I don't remember exactly, but it's something along the lines of this Israeli woman, I think, goes to New York probably, or somewhere in America, and she ends up coming back to Israel, and then instead of saying shalom or something, she says hello or something like that. So she basically the story is that acculturation or assimilation is the main threat to a Jewish identity. But like the underlying message here is this very clear anti-diasporist in a sense. And I mean, even the term diaspora and diasporas, these are all contentious terms. I'm just using it kind of as a shorthand here. It's not really my place to say who is diaspora, whatever. Like, that's up to people themselves to figure that out. But the underlying message, obviously, is that even if you are an Israeli who goes to New York and only hangs out with American Jews, you're still losing something, because the real representative of Judaism, as Netanyahu himself loves to self-proclaim constantly, or it's the Israeli state, symbolized in this ad or in these ads by the Israeli state. I think, by the way, there are like whole studies on this, so people are more free to really just look these up. And another thing, and on this topic of erasure, basically, my interest into Yiddish, and specifically the politics of Yiddish. So the thesis is language politics. So the politics of Hebrew, the politics of Yiddish, and the contemporary debate. I forgot what it's called. The contemporary debate on Zionism and diasporism or whatever. And the fact that for me something could be so important and powerful, and we have documentation that it was so important and powerful. So the Bund and Bundism in general. And then in the time span of a fraction, really, in its history, because we're talking about a language that's like at least over 1,000 years old, within 2-3 decades, essentially, really being wiped out, essentially at 90% or something. I don't have the numbers, but like a significant percentage of its speakers obviously killed, mainly in the Holocaust, and then in the Stalinist purges, and then, as we mentioned before, I'm not gonna repeat, but that is for me the reason why I got so attached to, at least for that period, I got so attached and so interested in learning about the Yiddish language, because there are parallels to the Palestinian story, and there are parallels to just stories of exile and migration and ethnic cleansing and all of these things. I saw parallels with the Armenian story. I saw parallels with, again, I mentioned the Palestinian story. The Kurdish story is an obvious one as well. And this is why it baffles me, really, that you don't really have to comment on this if you don't feel like it. But for me, like, as someone who's from Lebanon especially, and who supposedly there's this narrative that Lebanon is anti-Zionist and all of this, which is basically state, pretty much state ideology, or at least that's how it's performed, I would say, in Lebanon, in the performative sense. Despite all of this, there's basically zero effort, or there has been zero effort, to actually learn the context of where all of this came from. And if people don't really understand the story of Yiddish in the quote-unquote success or the quote-unquote victory of Zionism, then they're only looking at a small, not small, but like a part of the story here. So, as I repeat, it's not small, obviously, but like the Nakba and the conflicts between the so-called Arab-Israeli conflicts, those are part of the story. They're a big part of the story, obviously, a big part, especially of post-48 state of Israel. But it's, as we said, the Congress, the World Zionist Congress, and the first Jewish Labor Bund meeting, whatever it was called, was 1897. So we're talking about pretty much half a century in between, and people really should know what happened in that half century. Like, that's it. I don't know if there are any other parallels. Maybe the Armenian story is one a possible parallel of so much destruction in such a small amount of time. Obviously, referring here to the Holocaust, and the legacy of that being translated into these not random, but like weird and historical trajectories. And here I'm referring obviously to the state of Israel. So my point with all of this rambling is that Bundism for me is not necessarily something that, oh, people should study because it was perfect and idealistic and everyone was fantastic. I mean, I'm sure there were problems, as with everything.
Oh, definitely.
But, yes, I mean, but it's important. At least half a century of history. At some point, as you mentioned, the biggest movement from that community in the so-called Pale of Settlements and so on. So, yeah. Sorry, you were saying something.
So, one of the things, like one of the tragedies of Bundism to me is that because they were secular socialist internationalists, they, even though, they were a proud Jewish movement, they were a movement that profoundly wanted to work with other groups, that they were a member of, I think it was the second international. No, I'm sorry. They were a member of one of the major international socialist groupings. They had this faith in the international working class that, when you read it in retrospect and you know what happened, sounds incredibly naive, to the point where they're in the Warsaw Ghetto, right? They're risking their lives and foregoing food when they're starving to death to put out these newspapers in Yiddish and in Polish as well, so that they could smuggle them out to to their Polish comrades. And in these newspapers, they're writing about how they're not the main victims of Nazism, because the German working class is also crushed under the boot of Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true. I mean, not that the German working class wasn't crushed, but they were indeed the main victims of it. But they were always trying to sort of see themselves in this like very internationalist framework. Yeah. And after the war was over, there were constant lynchings of Jews in Poland, of people trying to return to their homes, and found someone was in the home, and then the person who had squatted in their home would kill them. There's also like a major pogrom in I'm butchering the Polish pronunciation, but Kielce, based on a blood libel. So people had just survived the Holocaust. The Polish Jewish community suffered more than any other Jewish community, I believe, in the Holocaust. It was, of the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, 3 million were Polish Jews. Mm-hmm. And so they just survived this, and then their neighbors are lynching them, right? And it's just not a country you can be in. And the Bundists that survived are still trying to tell people, like, Doikayt. And Jews then are like, no, I don't fucking want to stay here. And I was reading this memoir by Yakov Pat, who was a Bundist, he had fled in 1939, and then he returned in 1946 to distribute aid to the survivors. And every single person wants to get out of Poland, and they're all sneaking over the border into Germany to go into the American-occupied zone to get into these DP camps. And once they're in these displaced persons camps, they're applying for visas to every fucking country in the world, to like Australia, Brazil, Canada, America, anywhere they can, right? They want to get out of Europe, and they're getting rejected. And the survivors that were able to like escape and to reconstitute in America, they built a pretty close relationship with the American labor movement, and they were petitioning the government to give 400,000 visas to Jewish survivors. And the American government refused because they thought that they were communists, and also because they were racist. And so you had these people that were rotting, right? 1 year, 2 years in DP camps, often guarded by Germans. And then suddenly you have a group like the Haganah that's coming in that's like, we can get you out of this DP camp. We can put you on a smuggling ship, and you can get your manhood and your dignity back and join a militia and go kill some other people. And it's this, I think, one of the clearest examples I've ever seen of how a group of desperate refugees gets radicalized. People who, if they had been given a visa to New York, for instance, they would never even have been Zionists necessarily. Mm. And in Yakov Pat's book, he has this part where he's just talking about how horrible it is in Poland, and he ends it by saying, in Poland, you can hear the ships. Whether they're going to America or to Palestine, I don't know. It was written in 1946. Mm. And I've always thought that there are many reasons, obviously, that Bundism collapsed. The Nazi genocide, Stalin, American assimilation. But one of the reasons that's not appreciated is that after the war, when the remaining Bundists in America were asking for international solidarity and help for refugees, there was none on offer. And that you can only, as an oppressed group that's endured so much, keep saying like the world is good, your worker brothers will help you, for so long before people stop believing you, and before other more racist and exclusionary groups start taking advantage of that despair. Now, I wanted to return because it was like such a smart thing you said about Doikayt and the concept of New York.
Mm.
Now, I've often thought one of those kind of clarifying things about this horrific plague we're going through, and obviously this is not a cut and dry rule whatsoever. There's a million exceptions, but in general, if people have a choice about where they're going to be, right, for this, because we don't know when we're going to be able to move again, where you choose to be says a lot about where you think your home really is. And I'm in New York right now. I think there's like the New York Times say they think the death toll is like actually about 20,000 in New York City, though that's not the official death toll. And there's no place in the world that I would rather be. This is my home. It's where my mother was born. It's where my father came when he was a little kid. It's where my family has been for a really long time. And I can't imagine leaving New York at a moment like this when it's suffering so much. I can't imagine not doing everything I could for my city right now. I might, I love other places in the world. Like I would love to live in some other city at some point, but not now. Now, this is my country, right? New York City is my country. And perhaps that sounds exclusionary, but it's a city of 9 million. There are many countries that are smaller than that, and people say they're there. Yeah, exactly. If you can say like Lebanon is my country, you can say New York City is my country. I don't think one is any more petty than the other, right?
Yeah.
And this is a city that's become increasingly hard to live in if you're not rich, because the rents are just too damn high, and because you get, chucked out of your apartment at the end of the year, and the gentrification is off the hook, and it's really hard, right? And now those same people who have been so instrumental in making the city completely unaffordable for the working class have fled to their summer mansions in Montauk. I don't know what they're afraid of. Maybe they think that the corona will come through the walls. I don't know. But they've fled. And the working class of the city is dying because it's, keeping the world running at risk of getting infected with the virus. And sometimes, like when I walk the streets late at night and they're completely empty, right? You almost feel like, this city is, well, this will sound strange perhaps, but that all of the people who had kind of used the city, who had come here, to make some cash, to, have fun, but who didn't really love it, had left. And that the city, for a moment, even in this horrific moment where it's dying and where the Trump administration is helping it die, even at this specific moment, it feels like the city belongs to its people again. And yeah, I love it here so much. And I am doing everything that I possibly can to help it, and so are all my friends. There's a huge amount of mutual aid that's been set up. I mean, there's a lot of poverty, right? Because people's rents are so high and people are quite precarious here. And, people even who are like middle class people, they've lost everything overnight because they can't work now. And so there's all sorts of initiatives to get food to people, to support people who are rent striking. The largest rent strike in American history is going to kick off on May 1st in New York. There's a lot of stuff to help older people, get their food and get their meds. And just like lots of just giving each other money because everyone is kind of broke and trying to pool their resources. And like, this isn't an official mutual aid thing, but in my building, I have badass neighbors. I love them. And we're cooking for each other. We, do shopping for each other. We mail things for each other. Like we just help each other in a way that, even though we always liked each other before and we were always friends before, we just never thought to do because New York is so busy, And I have so many fears for what's going to happen with this city. I'm afraid that so many people are going to die, and then these Jared Kushner-style developer vampires are just going to sweep in and buy everything up and turn this into, I don't know, Dubai with much worse infrastructure. But maybe something that could happen that was good would be that, the hedge fund bastards and the developer bastards and the rich kids that they left, and that the city could return to being for its people again. And that may seem like a naive hope, but we must look for hope at this moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been talking about a movement that had to think that way. I mean, I can only imagine. Really, I don't know how what they went through. I can't really picture it, obviously, but suffice it to say that they definitely needed to have a sort of a vision, or at least some kind of hope that things can get better in order, well, probably to get through the day, I would assume. So, like, on this note, and again for like the 700th time, another awkward segue. I found while you were talking, I just remembered I had interviewed this guy, and this will be kind of like my end note in a sense, and then I'll just leave it up to you to end however you feel most comfortable. I was interviewing this guy while I was in London, and he was the one who was running this. I think they just called it like a non-Zionist Hebrew class or something like that. And he told me, and this is a quote that I have. One sec, sorry, let me find it. Learning Hebrew outside of the realm of its participation in erasure and dispossession in Palestine, while at the same time deeply engaging with those processes from an oppositional standpoint. So this is what he was trying to do, basically. I don't know if they're still active now. They're called Babel's Blessing, by the way. And so he, someone who speaks Hebrew, as I said, when he speaks to Palestinians, when he met Palestinians, including some of his students being Palestinians, when they called Hebrew the language of occupation, he can, and here I'm quoting, he can only nod in agreement, for this is their lived experience of a language that was forced on them, essentially. At the same time, when Jews say that they want to learn Hebrew in a different way, and here I'm quoting him again, they are expressing their critique of Zionism and interest in diasporic Hebrew culture. So this is something that's very interesting to me. It's kind of like the both worlds in a sense, like the diasporism on the one hand, but because Yiddish isn't as popular anymore, now there's Hebrew, and kind of like Hebrew replacing Yiddish, but in the context of diasporism, essentially. And there has been this, I haven't seen it myself, but I read a lot about it, like a kind of a revival of that phenomenon in Berlin among a lot of Israelis actually who leave Israel and then just settle down in Berlin. There's kind of this countercultural thing going on. I don't know how active it is today, but I had read about this while I was writing my thesis 4 years ago. And so I'll end on this basically, and this is just his quote. When you speak Yiddish, you always think about the past, whereas when you speak Hebrew, you think about the present. It's a quote-unquote everyday language. Yiddish is a language which got fixated in the past with the Holocaust, and there is always this longing of going back and thinking about going in the past, in the shtetl, small Jewish town for those who don't know in Eastern Europe, and all of that. Hebrew doesn't capture this longing for the past. I was quoting someone else actually. And then Hayim, the guy I was quoting at first, he says, I find in many cases that when Jews learn Arabic, Yiddish, and Hebrew in a decolonial diasporist context, as well as with anti-authoritarian teaching techniques, he was talking, by the way, about like the Paulo Freire pedagogy, basically, as well as with anti-authoritarian teaching techniques, it not only correlates with them having views that are critical of Zionism, but also facilitates exploring their own Jewish identities from different angles and in new stimulating ways, end quote. So like, this is what I wanted to end on. As I mentioned before, this is not my business, so to speak. I'm not saying this is how someone who's Jewish should be or shouldn't be. I'm just saying that, I mean, this, it could be such a tricky thing, especially as someone who's not from the community. I'm simply saying that what I found personally fascinating in this whole story is these tensions and contradictions. As I said before, there were Bundists who spoke Hebrew and there were Zionists who spoke Yiddish. As we know, it was never black and white basically. There were people who kind of were just in between and didn't really know how to identify themselves either. So yeah, this is what I wanted to end on. I hope for the listeners that my ramblings make sense, and I'll just leave it up to you to reflect or close or do whatever you want with this.
Well, one of the great ironies of Yiddish and Hebrew is that the positions are almost exactly reversed. 100 years ago, the argument perhaps against studying Hebrew was Hebrew is the language of your perfect dead prophets, and Yiddish is the language of the living Jewish street. And why do you always so fixated on the past? And now, Hasidim aside, Yiddish is the language of the idealized dead, and Hebrew is the language of the imperfect and generally deeply fucked up Jewish street in the country that I believe half the Jews in the world live. And so there is always this tension to that. I'm not learning Yiddish because I think that every Jew needs to learn Yiddish. I'm learning it because you can't write about the Bund without it. They did every single one of their documents in it until, I think until 2003, they were primarily working in Yiddish. I wonder why they didn't take off in America, right? But I think that anytime you learn a language, even this one, which I'm learning to commune with the dead, you're opening up yourself to another world. And I mean, that's why I do it with love. And I wanted to end with a quote, too. It was a quote, actually, about Zionism and Bundism that was written by a Bundist in 1947. And, he was writing this reflecting on a world where most Bundists had been killed. I think 97% of the Jews that stayed in Poland had been killed. So, most Bundists among them. And he wrote this, trying to defend his movement that he'd given his life to. And he said, "The great Jewish catastrophe has weakened the position of the Bund. In Poland, in the land of the greatest Jewish creativity, one cannot find those millions of Jews, those workers, artisans, regular people, from the black earth of whose lives and struggles the Bund drew the juices of growth and development. The tragedy is not only for the Bund, but for the entire Jewish people. One cannot speak of victors and losers on the Jewish street. War has left all parts of the Jewish people defeated. The idea of the Bund is a deep belief in mankind. The tendencies that are hostile to the Bund are based on a lack of this belief. The idea of belief in mankind is not popular today. In these last years, we have seen it become deeply debased, despoiled, and spat upon. But if man is at heart a beast, no amount of running away will help. There is no redemption for mankind, then there is no redemption for Jews. The beast will hunt those who run and meet them everywhere. If the belief disappears, then hope disappears. The victory of the Zionist idea is a victory for the failure of belief in mankind. It is a complete victory for hopelessness. The Bund has always put its cards on socialism, which means a better future for all humanity, and for all the people that make it up. If the dream of socialism becomes true, then there is no one to run from. If the dream dissipates, like so many of other better dreams of mankind, then there is nowhere to run to. The mirage of a little statelet surrounded by enemies is no amulet against anti-Semitism and extermination. The Bund has always fought for continuity, for creative national life, for Doikayt, for here-ness, for the right to remain rooted in the ground where the Jewish masses live and fight. This idea received from Nazism the most painful blow. The remnants of the Jewish masses lurch through the camps, wander around homeless, or float like splinters on the foaming waves of the stormy post-war world. But with every day it becomes clearer that the pathway to healing those wounds leads not through increasing the number of helpless wanderers, not through increasing the number of uprooted refugees, but through building and rebuilding. That's why I think that the Bund deserves listening to. Because the person who wrote that was not a soppy, cosseted liberal with a six-figure academic job. It was someone who had just seen his entire world destroyed, and that's still what he believed.
That's amazing. Molly, is there anything you wanted to add, or like I forgot to ask or forgot to mention or whatever?
No, this was great. It was such a pleasure to talk about these things with you.
Yeah, same here. As I said, I haven't talked about this in a long time, so this was very refreshing. Thanks a lot for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.